The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. That is not a thing that happens slowly. It does not ease in the way that ordinary cold eases in the way frost comes at the edges of a window and spreads toward the center over the quiet hours of a night. On the 9th of January, 1887, the cold came like a wall, like something solid moving across the Montana Valley at the speed of a galloping horse consuming the air ahead of it, the way a wave consumed a beach without pause and without the possibility of negotiation. And Clara Voss sat in the dark of her 8 by 10-foot shelter and listened to the world outside trying to kill everything it touched. She was not praying. She was not crying. She was counting. One full cord stacked against the north wall, 3/4 of a cord beside the stove, a quarter cord inside dry close enough to reach without opening the door. She had run the numbers so many times that the numbers had become a kind of breathing, automatic, necessary, the way her father had taught her. Thomas Voss had believed that a man who could not count was a man who could not survive. He had said this in German first, then in English, because he understood that Montana did not care what language you prayed in, but it absolutely cared whether you had enough wood to last until March. He had taught Clara to measure everything: the depth of snow by the fence line, the angle of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the behavior of cattle in the hour before a storm. Numbers were not cold things to Thomas Voss. Numbers were the difference between alive and not alive, and he had pressed that understanding into his daughter the way a blacksmith presses a mark into iron. Permanent, deep, hers. Clara Voss was 14 years old, and she sat in the dark on the 9th of January, 1887, while the temperature fell 50 degrees in 4 hours, and she counted her wood. She had enough. She had exactly enough. But that is the end of the story, and a story this hard deserves to be told from the beginning. 5 months earlier, Clara Voss had never stacked a single bale of hay in her life. August in Montana smells like dry grass and pine resin, and the particular mineral sharpness of creek water running cold over hot stones. The summer of 1886 had been good by Montana standards, which meant it had not actively tried to kill anyone since June, and the homestead that Thomas Voss had staked in the valley near Mercer Creek was beginning to look like something a man might actually keep. The cabin stood 12 feet by 14 feet logs, still pale from cutting, the chinking mud packed fresh between each course. Thomas had spent the entire summer on that cabin. Every board measured twice. Every corner checked with a plumb line he had carried from St. Louis in a cloth bag wrapped around his Bible. The man built like he was arguing with the wilderness, precisely, deliberately, as though every joint and every seam was a personal statement about what he intended to make of this place. Clara had helped with every inch of it, not because she was asked, but because she understood the way children of serious men come to understand that the work was not optional. Her mother had understood that too in the years before the cholera took her somewhere between St. Louis and the Montana line. Margaret Voss had died in a river camp in the summer of 1884 on a Tuesday with her boots still on and her hands still folded around Eli's blanket. Clara had been 12. Eli had been 6. Thomas Voss had not spoken more than 20 words for the rest of that journey west, but he had not stopped moving either. He had driven the wagon. He had cooked the meals. He had washed Eli's face every morning with cold water and combed the boy's hair with his fingers because the comb had been in Margaret's bag, and he could not bring himself to open it. Clara had watched all of this and had understood that grief for a man like Thomas did not look like grief. It looked like work. Eli Voss had been sick since before Margaret died. The journey west had made it worse. There was something wrong in the boy's lungs, some persistent wrongness that expressed itself as a cough that had never fully left him, a wet, rattling sound that lived in his chest like a tenant who refused to pay rent and also refused to leave. By the summer of 1886, the boy was 8 years old and thin in the way that worried Clara more than anything else she could name. That particular thinness that was not just childhood slenderness, but something deeper, something that suggested the body was spending its resources on things other than growing. He tired easily. He coughed through the night. He sat in patches of sunlight whenever he could find them, tipping his face up toward the warmth, with his eyes closed and Clara watching him from wherever she was working. Would think about what her father had said about winter preparation and feel the cold of it even in August. The 23rd of August, 1886 was a Thursday. Claire remembered that detail because Thursday was the day Thomas Voss had designated for timber, hauling the heavy work that required the horse and the logging chain and the particular concentration that made him quiet and focused in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. He had left before dawn. He had told Clara to keep Eli inside and out of the heat. He had taken the big roan horse and the chain and headed up the slope behind the homestead toward a stand of lodgepole pine he had marked 2 weeks earlier as the right timber for the woodpile that would carry them through their first Montana winter. Clara was splitting kindling near the cabin door when she heard the horse. Just the horse. Running, no wagon, no chain, no sound of Thomas calling out. Just the roan coming down the slope at full gallop with the logging chain dragging and rattling behind it. The horse's eyes showing white at the edges, its sides heaving with the effort of a full run that had started somewhere too far up the slope. And Clara knew. The way you know things that you do not want to know. The knowledge arrived before the thinking did. She knew before she started running. She found her father at the bottom of the ravine, 60 feet below the timber road. The logging chain had tangled around the base of a deadfall, and the horse had spooked, and the slope was steep and studded with rocks the size of wagon wheels. Thomas Voss lay at the bottom with his neck broken at an angle that no living person's neck could hold. His eyes were open. His right hand was still wrapped around the lead rope. He had not let go even at the end. Clara stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at her father for a long time. The August heat pressed down on her shoulders. A hawk circled somewhere above the tree line. Eli was back at the cabin, coughing in the shade. She did not go down into the ravine. There was no reason to go down into the ravine. She turned and walked back along the timber road and down through the pines and across the meadow to the cabin where she told Eli to stay inside and drink water. And then she walked 4 miles to the settlement of Mercer Creek without stopping. The road was dry and dusty, and the afternoon sun was full on her face, and she did not cry. She counted instead. She counted her steps. She counted the dollars in the tin box under the floorboards, which she had memorized $6.40. She counted the cords of firewood stacked against the cabin wall, which she had also memorized less than one cord, the wood Thomas had split in the evenings after the cabin work was finished, the evenings when he had worked by lantern light until his arms gave out. She counted the weeks until first frost, which her father had calculated as 6 to 8, and she counted the weeks until hard freeze, which he had put at 12 to 14. She counted the distance between what she had and what she needed, and the number that came out on the other side of that calculation was a number she could not think about directly yet. So she kept walking, and she kept counting her steps. And she arrived at Mercer Creek at 4 in the afternoon and found Roland Hecht standing outside the general store. Roland Hecht was 58 years old and had survived 11 Montana winters, which in 1886 was roughly equivalent to a military decoration. He had come to the territory in 1873 and had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite in the winter of 1879, a bad winter that had come early and stayed late and had killed 4 other settlers in the valley before it finally released its grip in April. He wore the missing fingers the way some men wear scars as evidence as credential. When Hecht spoke about winter preparation, the settlement listened the way it listened to the minister on salvation, not as opinion, as fact. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard kept close and pale eyes that had the quality of looking at you and at something behind you simultaneously, as though he was always calculating 2 things at once and giving full attention to both. He was not an unkind man. Clara had understood this even as a child. He was simply a man who had learned that sentimentality was a luxury that Montana winters did not extend, and he had organized his personality accordingly over 11 years of close study. Clara told him what she had found. She told him plainly and without embellishment, because Thomas Voss had raised her to report facts accurately, and she understood that the time for embellishment was not now and might never come again. Hecht listened without interrupting. When she finished, he called for 3 other men, and within an hour, 6 of them had ridden out with a wagon. By evening, Thomas Voss was buried in the hard ground behind the Lutheran church, and Clara Voss was alone with a sick brother and a homestead she had no idea how to keep. The numbers did not lie. That was the first thing Clara thought the morning after the funeral, standing outside the cabin in the early light with a cup of water she was too tired to drink. The numbers did not lie, and the numbers were telling her something she did not want to hear. She had learned the winter arithmetic from her father the previous October, sitting at the table with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown paper while he talked, and she wrote. A Montana winter for a log cabin the size of theirs required 7 cords of firewood at minimum. 8 was safer. 10 was comfortable. Thomas had stacked less than 1 cord before he died. He had planned to cut the rest through September and October. A strong man working full days could cut and split 1 cord per week, perhaps 1 cord and a quarter if the timber was good and close. Thomas Voss had been a strong man. Clara was not a strong man. She was a 14-year-old girl who weighed considerably less than her father's axe, and if she worked every day from now until the ground froze solid, she might manage 2 cords. 3 if she were very lucky and very strong, and if nothing else went wrong. That left her 4 cords short. In a cabin with 8-inch log walls in a Montana winter, 4 missing cords was the difference between alive and not alive. She was still standing there with her cup of water when Roland Hecht rode up. He had come, he said, to discuss the situation. He had been watching from the store as she tried to split a round of pine with Thomas's axe the previous day, and the axe had bounced off the wood and nearly taken her shin, and that had confirmed for him what he had already suspected. He told her the numbers plainly, the way she had come to understand that plain people stated plain things plainly, without cruelty, but without softening either, because softening a number did not change the number. 8 cords minimum, 10 to be safe. She didn't have the strength to cut 2, and she didn't have the money to buy what she couldn't cut. He glanced toward the cabin door where Eli sat in the August heat, making the sound that Claire had stopped being able to hear without a tightening in her chest. The boy's lungs, Hecht said, would kill him before the cold even arrived if he didn't have consistent warmth. A drafty cabin fighting a losing battle against a Montana winter was not consistent warmth. It was a slow sentence with a predetermined verdict. The settlement had talked it over. The Coltons could take Eli. Nora Colton had experience with sick children and the patience that experience built. Clara could work for room and board through the winter, help with cooking and cleaning. And in the spring, when the territorial authorities sorted out the homestead claim, decisions could be made properly by people with the standing to make them. Clara listened to all of this without speaking. When Hecht finished, she asked him what would happen if she found another way. Hecht looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, the way a man looks at someone he respects enough to tell the truth to rather than the comfortable version of it. He said there was no other way. There never had been. The settlers who had tried to make it through their first Montana winter without adequate preparation were buried in the churchyard, and the ones who were not buried in the churchyard were the ones who had accepted help when it was offered and had been humble enough to understand that experience was not something you accumulated by refusing it. She had until the end of the week to decide. After that, Hecht said they all had their own winters to prepare for, and no one could spare the time to keep coming back to ask the same question. He rode away. Clara watched him go. Then she set down the axe and the cup of water and sat on the chopping block and thought about mathematics. Not about fear, not about grief. About mathematics, because her father had taught her that panic was a resource you spent without getting anything back, while calculation was a resource that paid dividends every time you applied it correctly. What she knew: $6.40, less than 1 cord of cut wood, flour for approximately 6 weeks at reduced portions, dried beans for longer, salt, smoked meat her father had put up in July, 1 milk cow that would need hay through the winter, 4 chickens that would need shelter and grain, Thomas's axe too heavy, his cross-cut saw manageable, a hammer and nails and basic tools. Nothing that could multiply her strength or slow the coming of winter by a single day. What she needed: 7 cords minimum, enough money to buy what she couldn't cut, which she didn't have, a strong adult to help, which she didn't have, more time than existed between now and the first hard freeze, which no one had. The mathematics was clear. Heck's assessment had, if anything, been generous. She could not survive this by conventional means. The conventional means had been calculated by men who had survived 11 winters, and the calculation came out wrong for her no matter how many times she ran it. There was no arrangement of the available numbers that produced a survivable outcome, but she had until the end of the week. 3 miles east of Clara's homestead, in a cabin that stood close to the creek bank where the cottonwoods lined the water and cast long shadows in the afternoon, Orrin Seeger was also doing mathematics. He was 68 years old, and he had been doing mathematics since August, and the mathematics kept coming out the same way no matter how he arranged the numbers. His woodpile was short, not catastrophically short, not the way a careless man's pile would be short from neglect or laziness. Short in the particular way of a man who had been short before and had survived it and had come to believe somewhere in the part of himself that he did not examine closely. That short was probably going to be all right because short had been all right before. Martha had believed otherwise. Martha Seeger had been many things in the 20 years of their marriage, but she had been above all else a woman who noticed things and said what she noticed without apology and without waiting for someone to ask her opinion before offering it. She had noticed every winter of their life together in Montana that their cabin was cold. Not cold the way a cabin in a bad patch of weather is cold, but cold in the structural sense. Cold in the way of a building that had not been designed adequately for the climate in which it had been placed. The logs were good but not thick enough. The gaps had been chinked but not well enough, and the wind had years of practice finding what the chinking missed. Wind found the corners in a way that suggested the wind had been studying those corners for a long time and had finally arrived at certain conclusions. Every winter, Martha had told Orrin that hay would be warmer than wood. Not as a joke, not as a passing observation made while doing something else. As a genuine conviction she had arrived at through direct experience and had held on to through every dismissal. She had once spent a night in a hay barn during a storm when she was a girl, burrowed into the center of a loose hay pile with her sisters after the storm made travel impossible, and she had been warmer than she had ever been in any building before or since. She had tried to explain the physics of it to Orrin, the air trapped in the grass, the density of the mass, the way it held temperature instead of bleeding it away through every surface. Orrin had listened with the expression of a man who was listening but not quite hearing, an expression that Martha had described to him on more than one occasion with the precision of someone who had been watching it for 20 years. He had not built the hay walls. In the winter of 1881, a hard winter that had come down fast and mean in the first week of January, their woodpile had run short. Not by much, not by a devastating margin that a reasonable man would have seen coming and acted on. Just enough that on a Tuesday night in the second week of January, Orrin had gone out into what looked like a manageable snowfall to gather deadfall from the tree line 200 yards from the cabin. The snow had thickened while he was in the trees. Not a blizzard, not the howling white catastrophe that the territory was capable of in its worst moods. Just a steady, dense snowfall that reduced visibility to arm's length and erased the landmarks a man depended on to find his way back to his own door. He had gotten turned around. It had taken him 40 minutes to find the cabin, 40 minutes that had felt like hours. And he had come inside to find Martha sitting in the chair near the stove, with a blanket pulled around her, and the fire burned down to coals and the temperature inside the cabin hovering at something just above freezing. She had died by morning, not violently, not with drama or struggle. The cold had worked its way in the way it always worked its way in when the walls let it, and Martha's heart, which had been giving her trouble for 2 years, had made a decision in the hours while Orrin was lost in the trees. He had found her in the chair, still sitting upright, eyes closed, the blanket still arranged around her shoulders as though she had put it there deliberately, the stove cold. That had been 5 years ago. Orrin Seeger had lived in that cabin for 5 years since then, and he had cut wood every fall, and he had been short every winter, and he had survived every winter. And somewhere in that sequence of events, he had arrived at a state that was not quite living in the way most people use the word. He ate. He worked his small garden in the summer months. He chopped wood, not enough wood, never quite enough wood. As though the insufficiency itself had become a habit he no longer questioned. He watched the seasons turn with the detached attention of a man who was observing rather than participating. He went to the settlement when he needed supplies and came home as quickly as the distance allowed. He did not speak much. The settlement regarded him as strange, a little unnerving, in the particular way of men who have been thoroughly broken by something and have not been put back together, but essentially harmless and best left to his arrangements. In August of 1886, Orrin Seeger stacked his woodpile, counted the cords, and knew it was not enough. He thought about Martha, and then he did nothing. He had seen the Voss girl trying to split wood. He had watched her from the tree line one morning, the big axe bouncing off the pine round the girl's arms, shaking with the effort, the set of her shoulders carrying a determination that reminded him uncomfortably and specifically of Martha. The way Martha had stood when she was about to say something she had already decided to say, regardless of how it was received. That quality of having made up one's mind completely and being in the process of following through no matter what the world offered in response. He had watched from the trees. He had not walked over. He told himself it was not his business, which was the kind of statement that sounds like a reason, but is actually a choice wearing the clothing of a reason. September came in cold. The old-timers felt it first, the way people who have paid close attention to a place for many years feel its shifts before the instruments confirm them. Frost on the 3rd of September, weeks earlier than the valley's normal pattern. Night temperatures dropping into the 30s when they should have held in the 40s for another month. The light changing in its quality, losing the long golden warmth of late summer and replacing it with something thinner, more provisional. The creek running higher than it should for August snowmelt. Cattle bunching in the mornings without being driven to it. Clara noticed none of this immediately because she was working. She had not accepted Heck's offer and she had not refused it. She had told him she would decide by week's end, and then she had spent the week swinging the axe and moving what wood existed and calculating and recalculating and arriving at the same insufficient answer every time. By the 8th of September, she had added a quarter cord to her woodpile, which was progress of a kind, but the kind that reminded you of the distance remaining rather than the distance covered. On the 10th of September, she climbed the ridge behind the homestead to look for deadfall timber. The slope above was thick with lodgepole pine, but the nearest accessible stands were 3 miles out, too far to drag logs alone without a horse, and she did not have a horse. She reached the ridgeline at mid-morning and stopped. Below her in the valley to the north, the elk were moving. Not a few animals browsing through the lower meadows. A river of them, hundreds, perhaps more, flowing down from the high country in long, dark streams crossing the creek flats, pressing toward the valley floor, with a purpose that was unmistakable to anyone who understood what elk normally did in September and what they were doing now instead. They moved the way water moves toward low ground, not because something was chasing them, but because something was directing them. Something that operated below the threshold of human perception, but well within the range of animal knowledge. Their breath steamed in the September air. The sound of them, the soft percussion of thousands of hooves on dry grass, carried up the ridge to where Clara stood. Elk did not come down from the high country in September. Everyone in the valley understood this. The migration happened in late October, sometimes November, driven by the first real snows at elevation. What Clara was watching was 6 weeks early, 6 full weeks, and the animals were not browsing and resting in their gradual way, but moving with the steadiness of things that had received information and were acting on it. Her father had spoken of this once, sitting at the kitchen table in Hamburg when Clara was 9 years old, and winter was a theoretical concept rather than a thing that killed people. He had talked about the old mountain people and what they watched and why they watched it, and he had said that when the animals came down early, you doubled your woodpile because the animals knew what was coming before the instruments could measure it and before the sky showed its hand. He had said it the way he said things, he believed, completely without drama, without elaboration, just a fact placed in the air and left there to mean what it meant. Clara stood on the ridge and watched the elk and thought about her father, and then she ran. She ran back down the slope and through the pines and across the meadow and along the road to Mercer Creek. And she arrived breathing hard to find Roland Hecht standing outside the general store, the way he nearly always stood there in the afternoon talking to two other men about the early frost. She told him about the elk. She told him the numbers, the direction they were moving, how early they were, and what her father had said about animals and early migration, and what it signaled for winter preparation. She said all of this as plainly and as accurately as she knew how, because she had been raised to report facts accurately, and she understood that her credibility in this moment was the only tool she had available. Hex looked at her, then at the two men beside him, then back at her with the expression of a man who has already decided something and is waiting for the conversation to catch up to his decision. Elk move for 100 reasons, he said. Predators moving through the high country, drought affecting the grays at elevation, a fire somewhere beyond the visible horizon. A child watching animals from a ridgeline was not prophecy, and treating it as such was the kind of thinking that led to poor decisions. Clara told him it was not just watching. She told him about the numbers and the direction and the timing and the particular quality of the movement, the way it looked like animals acting on knowledge rather than animals reacting to disturbance. Hecht interrupted her. He said she had enough to worry about without inventing weather signs from animal migrations. Then he turned back to the two men and continued his conversation, and Clara stood there for a moment in the September air and understood that she had been dismissed completely. She tried others. Nora Colton, who was kind about it, in the way of people who are experienced at managing children showing signs of distress. The minister who said he would pray for clarity for all of them. The woman who ran the boarding house, and the man at the feed store, and the elderly German couple who had homesteaded the valley before anyone else, and whose judgment was generally respected. The responses varied only in their degree of gentleness. Some smiled. Some suggested carefully that perhaps the stress of recent events was affecting her perspective. And once walking past the general store, she heard a woman's voice say, not quietly enough to be private, the Voss girl is trying to frighten people into giving her more assistance. Attention-seeking. Poor thing. By the 15th of September, Mercer Creek had settled on a name for her. The girl who cried wolf. The girl who preferred inventing disasters to accepting the help being offered. The settlement went about its preparation with the thorough confidence of people who had survived difficult winters before and saw no reason to change what had worked. Clara walked home from her last attempt on a September evening that smelled wrong for its date. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees. It should have been 55. She passed the Colton farm on the way and stopped at the fence line without having decided to stop. The hay bales were stacked in the field in great organized walls, compressed and dense, hundreds of them waiting for the cattle that would consume them across the winter months. They sat in the evening light like a small city of uniform buildings, and Clara looked at them the way her father had taught her to look at everything as a problem in mathematics, as a question of what a thing was and what properties it possessed and what those properties might be made to do. She thought about the night in the hay barn. She could not have been older than 10. A storm had come up fast on the journey west, a sudden squall that dropped temperatures in 20 minutes and turned rain to ice, and a farmer had waved their wagon toward his property, and her father had driven them into the barn. They had burrowed into the center of a loose hay pile, all four of them, and her mother had been frightened at first because it was dark and close and smelled of living things. And then the warmth had come, that remarkable warmth that had nothing to do with fire or stove, just the mass of dry grass holding the heat of their bodies and returning it to them. And her father had laughed and said it was warmer than their house in Hamburg, and her mother had stopped being frightened. Clara stood at the fence in the September dark and thought about what hay did when you were inside it. If hay kept warmth in it, kept cold out. The same property that had sheltered 4 people in a storm would shelter 2 people in a winter if you built it correctly, if you understood what you were working with, if you ran the mathematics and followed where they led, regardless of whether anyone else had followed them before. Not a barn full of loose hay, something structured, something designed, something with walls. She stood there while the last light left the sky and the temperature dropped another degree. In the Colton farmhouse, a lamp moved from window to window, someone carrying it through the rooms of an ordinary evening. The hay bales sat in their patient rows, and the calculation assembled itself in Clara's mind with the slow precision of something being built from reliable materials. She went home and sat at the table and began to think it through. The idea came to her the way useful ideas come, not as inspiration but as calculation. And calculation was a language she trusted. She worked through it the way her father had taught her to work through any problem that mattered. You started with what you knew because what you knew was fixed and reliable, and you built from there toward what you wanted to determine. What you wanted was just a direction. The mathematics told you whether the direction was reachable. What she knew about hay-dense dry, when properly stored, structured around millions of small air pockets, held inside the mass of the bale. Her father had explained once why hay made good insulation for root cellars. Those air pockets did not conduct heat the way solid material did. Air held still and maintained its temperature. Hay was organized stillness, and organized stillness was the thing that kept warmth from moving where you did not want it to go. What she knew about log cabins, they leaked. Not in the obvious way of a damaged roof, but in the structural way of a wall that was itself the problem. 8 inches of pine conducted heat from inside to outside in a steady and unrelenting transfer that no amount of careful chinking fully interrupted. Wind found the seams. Cold found the wood. You fed the stove continuously, fighting a battle you could never win outright, only sustain. What she knew about mathematics: if you change the inputs, you change the output. A wall 3 feet thick made of compressed hay would not conduct heat the way a wall 8 inches thick made of pine did. The difference was not incremental. You were not comparing two versions of the same thing. You were comparing a wall that bled warmth to a wall that held it. A structure with walls built that way would not need 7 cords of fuel to survive a Montana winter. It would need something closer to two cords she could cut. The structure would have to be small, 8 feet by 10, just large enough for 2 people and a stove. The ceiling low to minimize the volume of air that needed heating. One window south-facing, a door built tight. Not a cabin in the sense that settlers built cabins. Something closer to what her father might have called, in his precise way, a thermal system. A container designed to hold one thing: warmth. She drew it out on a piece of brown paper with a stub of pencil, with measurements and ratios and notations where the math needed checking. She calculated the number of bales for walls 2 courses deep staggered at the joints. She calculated the weight per course and whether she could manage it alone. She calculated the time required for transport, stacking, and plastering against the weeks remaining before the ground froze. The numbers were tight, but they were not impossible. And impossible had been the only verdict that would have sent her to Heck's door to accept his offer. She would go to Gareth Colton in the morning. Gareth Colton was 35 years old and had come to Montana from Ohio with a practical man's resistance to things that had not been done before, and a practical man's understanding that not having been done before was not by itself proof that a thing could not work. He farmed with a notebook in his breast pocket and a measuring stick leaning against his barn door, and he trusted evidence more than he trusted assertions. Clara understood this, which shaped how she approached the conversation. She was waiting outside his barn at first light. She did not ask for hay. She told him what she intended to do and explained the thermal mathematics as clearly as she could, using the vocabulary of someone who had learned physics from her father's brown paper notebooks, rather than from any formal instruction. She explained the air pockets and the heat transfer and the wall thickness and the relationship between interior volume and heating requirement. She told him she needed the damaged bales from his west stack, the ones soaked by August rain that he had been planning to burn before they finished rotting. Colton listened with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, giving it a fair hearing without making it a sympathetic one. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he walked to the west stack and pulled back the tarpaulin and looked at the damaged bales mottled at their edges, smelling of the particular sweetness of organic matter beginning its slow return to earth. He said hay rotted. He said it burned. He said hay was for cattle, not for people, and that building a human shelter from cattle feed was the kind of idea that sounded different at a table with a pencil than it did in the actual cold. He said these things as statements of fact rather than arguments without cruelty because he was not a cruel man. Clara told him about the mud plaster, the mixture of clay-rich soil and water and chopped straw applied thick to both interior and exterior surfaces would seal the hay against moisture and fire both. The plaster would make the walls neither hay nor wood, but something else entirely, a composite material with properties that neither component had on its own. Colton looked at the damaged bales. He looked at Clara. He looked at the bales again. He said he was not going to help her die. He said it plainly and without malice. But those bales were trash he had been meaning to clear for 2 weeks, and if she wanted to haul away his garbage and build a grass hut with it, he was not going to stand in her way. He was not helping her. He was clearing his field. She should understand the difference. Clara said she understood the difference. She said thank you. He said not to thank him. She found out the weight of a single bale on the first morning of hauling by, attempting to lift one and failing. She tried again with her legs bent the way she had seen Thomas lift heavy things, and the bale came up. She took 3 steps. Her arms gave out. The bale dropped in the dust. 40 pounds. The bale weighed 40 pounds, which was a manageable load for a grown man and a significant load for a 14-year-old girl who had already been working 12-hour days for 3 weeks running. The building site was 300 feet from the Colton West stack. She needed 60 bales minimum. She did the division at the rate she had just demonstrated. She could move perhaps 8 bales in a day. 8 days just for transport before a single course had been stacked. She picked up the bale again. Eli was outside the old cabin when she got back with the first bale sitting in a patch of September sun with his back against the south wall. He looked at the bale. He looked at Clara's arms still shaking from the carry. He asked what she was doing. She told him everything. The full plan with the mathematics intact, including the odds as she had calculated them in the timeline as she had mapped it. She told him because he was 8 years old and sick, and she was all he had, and she believed, as her father had believed, that people who needed to understand something deserved to be told it clearly rather than protected from it with comfortable simplifications. Eli listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked down at his thin hands for a moment, a child's hands on a frame that had not grown the way it was supposed to. Then he looked up and said he could not lift. He said it without self-pity as a simple acknowledgement of what his body would and would not do. But he said he could sharpen. He had his knife. He understood the staking she was describing. The wooden pins driven through each course to lock the structure against lateral movement. He could sit outside and cut branches to length and sharpen the ends to points. He could do that all day without lifting anything heavier than a stick. Claire went to the debris pile and found the straightest branches Thomas had cleared from the building site and handed them to Eli with Thomas's small folding knife. And without another word, she went back to Colton's West stack for the second bale. By midday, she had moved 4 bales. Her shoulders felt as though something had been slowly torn loose from its moorings. Her palms were blistered and bleeding in the creases where the bale twine had cut in. She sat with her hands in the cold creek water and looked at her progress, and did not give herself the luxury of feeling discouraged because her father had taught her that discouragement was just another resource spent without return. She got up and went back for the 5th bale. Eli made 20 stakes that first day. He made them slowly and steadily, working with the focused patience of someone who understands that what they can do and what they want to do are different things, and who has decided to do what they can do with complete attention. His cough interrupted him regularly, the wet, rattling sound that Clara had learned to set aside without ignoring because she could not fix it and she needed to keep working. Each time the coughing passed, Eli picked up the knife and went back to the slow, careful work of making something sharp and straight and useful from raw material. The settlement observed, with a particular mixture of curiosity and dismissal, that small communities reserve for things outside their established categories. The story spread because stories always spread in places where new events are the primary currency of conversation. The Voss girl was building something from hay out on the east field. A compost heap, someone said, and the description stuck because it was funny in the way that things are funny when they are also a little sad. The children from the Colton farm rode past on their way to the creek and looked at the rising courses of baled grass with frank curiosity, and the adults discussed it in the tones they reserved for things they had already decided about. Clara stacked the first course at ground level and discovered the physics of it firsthand. Bales laid flat staggered at the corners like bricks, each course interlocked with the one below. The first course was straightforward ground level, no lifting required. The second course meant raising each bale to waist height. The third course meant overhead lifting 40 pounds of compressed grass held at chest height while she positioned it against the course below. She could not do it. 4 attempts on the second day of stacking. 4 times the bale came to chest height and her arms gave out. She sat in the dirt after the 4th failure with her arms hanging at her sides, genuinely empty of whatever resource lifting required, and thought about what she was missing. She was missing the mechanical advantage that her father's world had taken for granted, because it was built for men with the upper body strength to move 40-pound objects overhead without special arrangements. She went to the debris pile and found 2 straight planks from Thomas's lumber offcuts. She laid them against the second course as a ramp at a shallow angle and tried pushing the bale up the incline rather than lifting it directly. The bale moved, slowly with sustained effort, but it moved up the ramp without requiring her to hold its full weight. She pushed it to the top and tipped it onto the third course, and it seated cleanly. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went for another bale. The ramp was not elegant, and it was not fast, but it worked, and working was what the situation required. She added it to the system as a fixed element with known parameters, 10 minutes per bale for the third course, instead of 4 minutes for the lower ones. She recalculated the timeline. It still fit. Barely. On the morning of October 8th, Helga Brandt appeared at the building site. Clara had been expecting something of this kind. She had known since the day of Hecht's visit with his ultimatum that the settlement's patience with her situation was finite, and she had factored the likelihood of formal intervention into her working timeline, the way you factored weather into any outdoor project, a risk you could not eliminate but might outrun if you moved efficiently. Helga Brandt was 51 years old and had lived in the valley for 12 years, and she had lost a daughter to winter sickness in 1883, a girl named Kristen, who had been 9 years old and who had died in the cabin where Helga still lived, in a bed that Helga had not been able to remove for 2 years after. The settlement knew about Kristen. It was not talked about casually because the settlement understood at some collective level that certain losses were too large for casual conversation, but the knowledge lived in the background of every interaction with Helga Brandt, the way the knowledge of a serious injury lives in the background of watching a person move. Brandt stood at the edge of the building site with her hands folded and watched Clara position a bale on the second course of the north wall. She did not announce herself. When Clara turned and saw her, they looked at each other in the October light, which was already thinner and more direct than September's, the sun lower on the horizon, the shadows longer, the first genuine cold establishing itself in the mornings. Brandt said she had come to tell Clara something she thought Clara deserved to know. She said it directly in the manner of women who have lost something substantial enough that small social courtesies no longer seem worth the effort. She said she had written to the territorial authority herself, not through Hecht, not as part of any collective decision, but alone in her own name. A separate letter describing what she had observed at the Voss homestead. A sick child, an inadequate structure, a 14-year-old girl making decisions that no 14-year-old girl had the experience to make correctly. Clara set down the bale stake she was holding. Brandt said she was not cruel. She said she wanted Clara to understand that. She said she had watched her Kristen turn the color that children turn when the warmth left them, and she knew what it sounded like at the end, and she was not willing to watch another child reach that end when there were families in the valley willing to provide what Eli needed. Clara said nothing for a moment. She looked at the north wall 3 courses high, the bales locked and staked, the clay plaster beginning to dry to a pale tan on the exterior face. She thought about 2 letters traveling somewhere in the territorial mail system and what an inspector would see when he arrived. She said she understood why Brandt had written the letter. Something moved in Brandt's face that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of both the recognition of an unexpected response in an unexpected place. She said she hoped Clara understood that love and preparation were different things, and that a child's fierce love for a sibling did not change the temperature outside. Then she turned and walked back toward the settlement road without looking back, and Clara watched her go and picked up the bale stake and went back to work. That evening, she recalculated everything. 2 letters, one from Hecht sent weeks ago, one from Brandt more recent. The completion of the structure was now a legal deadline as well as a weather deadline, and the two were pressing from opposite directions with Eli's future held between them. She worked faster. The 19th of October brought clouds low and purposeful sitting on the ridgetops and making the valley feel enclosed. Clara was plastering the third wall when the rain began. Not a drizzle, but a cold October rain, steady and committed. She worked through the first hour of it, her hands going numb in the clay mixture, telling herself the plastered walls were sealed, telling herself the unplastered fourth wall would hold for one storm. She was wrong. The rain fell for 6 hours. It found the unplastered east wall with the patient thoroughness of water going where water goes. By the time the rain stopped, 2 sections of the east wall had swollen and shifted, and the bottom course had lost its coherence, the bales splaying apart at the joints. Clara stood in the dusk and looked at the collapsed sections without speaking. Eli was in the doorway of the old cabin, too far away to offer anything useful, watching her with the honesty of someone who knows that the available comfort is insufficient and declines to offer it anyway. 3 days of work. Gone. The waterlogged bales would need replacement. She would need to plaster immediately after each section of stacking rather than waiting for the full structure to be complete. The roof framing needed to move earlier in the sequence. She was working through the revised timeline when she heard footsteps behind her. Orrin Seeger was 68 years old and carried himself with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned to spend his physical resources without waste because he was no longer certain of the supply. He wore a coat that had been good once and was still functional. He carried a flat-bladed shovel. He walked to the edge of the damaged east wall and set the shovel blade under the nearest fallen bale and began assessing the extent of it with the systematic attention of a man who approached repair as a technical problem. Clara said he did not have to do this. Seeger pulled a waterlogged bale free and set it aside. He said he knew he did not have to. He said his wife's name had been Martha. He said she had been for 20 years of their marriage a woman who noticed things other people missed and said what she noticed without waiting to be asked. He said she had told him many times that hay was warmer than wood, that the air trapped inside the grass held warmth in a way that wood could not, that a structure built with walls of hay thick enough would be survivable on a fraction of the fuel a log cabin required. He pulled another waterlogged bale free. He said he had never believed her, not because the idea was impossible, but because it was unfamiliar, and he had confused unfamiliar with impossible, the way people often did when they found a way that worked well enough and stopped looking for better. He set down the shovel and looked at Clara directly for the first time. Martha had frozen in their cabin in January of 1881, he said. The wood ran short, not by much. He had gone out to find deadfall in what looked like a manageable snowfall and gotten turned around in the dark, and by the time he found his way back, the fire was coals, and the cabin was nearly freezing, and Martha's heart had decided it was done. She had been sitting in the chair near the stove, eyes closed, blanket on her shoulders. He had thought she was sleeping for almost a minute. He was quiet. He said he was not helping Clara. He said it with the precision of a man who understood the difference between what he was doing and what it might be mistaken for. He was finding out if Martha had been right. He had been wondering that for 5 years, and he was going to keep wondering it until he had an answer, and the only way to get the answer was to see the structure built and tested. That was all. He picked up the shovel again. They worked until it was too dark to see. Seeger did not speak again except to ask practical questions about staking intervals and plaster mixture and the reasoning behind the roof structure she had planned. He asked the way a craftsman asks for information rather than conversation, and he listened with the full attention of someone trying genuinely to understand something. Clara answered precisely, giving him the same quality of information she would have given her father. Seeger came back at first light the next day without being asked. He helped restack the east wall and plaster it before anything else, prioritizing the most vulnerable surface. He showed her, without making a lesson of it, a method for driving the bale stakes at an angle rather than straight down, which increased the lateral resistance of each connection. Clara understood the principle immediately and adapted her staking on all remaining courses accordingly. On the second evening, as the light failed, Clara asked him why he had come now, weeks after she had started. Seeger was washing plaster off his hands in the creek water. He said he had not been sure before the rain that it would work. He said watching the east wall come down had clarified something: the problem was solvable, and the fact that it was solvable meant that not solving it was a choice. He said he had made enough choices of that kind. He dried his hands on his coat and walked back toward his property in the dusk without looking back. Clara watched him go and understood, with the clarity that comes from having heard something very honest, that Orrin Seeger had not come to the building site because of her. He had come because of Martha. And that was exactly what the situation needed. He did not come back after the second day. What he had given her was the rebuilt east wall and the corrected staking method, and 2 days of work from hands that knew what they were doing, and that was enough to change the outcome of the calculation. She went back to work alone. The first day of November was a Thursday, the same day of the week as the day her father had gone to cut timber for the last time. Clara noticed this without giving it more weight than it deserved, because coincidences and dates were something the mind generated without authorization, and that authorized nothing in return. The structure was complete. 8 feet by 10 feet, walls nearly 3 feet thick through their full perimeter, 2 courses of bales laid flat, staggered at every joint, pinned with Eli stakes at 6-inch intervals through each connection. The exterior face plastered in 2 coats of clay mixture, smooth enough that wind would find nothing to grip. The interior plastered as well, a single coat enough to seal the hay and hold warmth rather than absorb it. The roof framed with salvaged timber from a collapsed equipment shed, covered with a layer of sod and a finishing coat of plastered hay. A raised wooden floor on low joists, creating an air gap that prevented cold from wicking upward through the ground. A south-facing window, small shuttered with oiled canvas over a plank frame. A door from scrap lumber hung on leather hinges, cut from a worn harness strap. And in the corner, secured to the floor, joist with iron bolts, Thomas Voss's small iron stove, its clay pipe chimney rising through the roof in a collar of packed mud that had dried hard and clean. The old log cabin stood 50 feet away, pale logs and cracking chinking, everything her father had built, and everything that had not been enough. Clara did not look at it. She carried the bedding from the old cabin to the new structure folded. Eli's blankets on the lower bunk hung her father's coat on the peg beside the door. She loaded the stove with 3 small pieces of dry pine and struck a fire. That night, with the fire burning low and the outside temperature at 12 above zero, Clara held her hand against the interior wall and felt warmth radiating back from the plaster. Not the aggressive heat of a stove surface. Something slower, more even, the warmth of something that had been holding heat for a long time and intended to continue holding it indefinitely. She checked the thermometer nailed beside the door, a gift from the mathematics teacher who had first taught her father to measure things precisely, carried from Hamburg in the same cloth bag as the plumb line. 58 degrees, 12 outside. A difference of 46 degrees held by 3 feet of compressed grass and 2 coats of mud. Eli was asleep on the lower bunk, breathing slow and even, the wet, rattling sound quieter than it had been in months, the warmth working on his damaged lungs with the patient consistency that no drafty log cabin had been able to provide. Clara sat on the floor near the stove and listened to the silence. Outside, Montana was preparing to kill everything that was not ready for it. The elk had known this in September. The barometer had known it. The early frost had known it, and the quality of the October light, and the way the cattle bunched in the mornings, and the silence of the birds in late October, and the iron color of the northern horizon that the old-timers had been looking at without speaking for 2 weeks, because what they saw there was something they had not seen since 1881. Clara had 1 3/4 cords of firewood stacked against the north wall. At the rate of consumption she had observed this first week, a quarter cord every 6 weeks, she had fuel for 24 weeks. Mid-April, the worst would be over by mid-March. She had a margin, narrow, allowing no room for error or surprise, but a margin. She thought about Orrin Seeger alone in his cabin 3 miles east with the woodpile she had seen from the road and the memory of Martha sitting in the chair. She thought about what he had said, that not solving a solvable problem was a choice. The stove ticked its small metallic rhythm. Eli breathed. The wind moved across the valley without finding anything to grip on the smooth, plastered surface of the walls. The math was working. For the first time since August, the math was working. December came without announcement, the way dangerous things sometimes came. The cold arrived in increments, each night a degree or two lower than the one before, the ground hardening from the surface down the creek, at the eastern edge of the Voss claim, going silent as ice thickened from the banks inward, until only the center channel still moved black and quick between white margins. The December sky had a quality Clara had not seen in the earlier months, a flatness, a finished quality, as though it had said everything it intended to say and was waiting. Inside the hay shelter, the temperature held at 52 degrees on the coldest nights, sometimes 54. The stove burned small and steady, and the walls did what Clara's mathematics had said they would. They absorbed the warmth during the hours the stove ran and released it slowly through the hours it did not. The thermal mass of 3 feet of compressed grass acting as a buffer between the fire's intermittent output and the air that Eli breathed. The temperature did not spike when the fire was fed and did not plummet when it burned low. It held the way deep water holds its temperature in autumn, giving it up only reluctantly to the cold pressing from every direction. Eli slept through the nights without coughing. Clara had not let herself expect this. Expecting it would have meant spending the energy of hope before the outcome was confirmed, and her father had taught her that hope spent in advance was hope unavailable when it was needed. But by the second week of December, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The consistent warmth, the absence of the drafts that had made the log cabin a place where temperature swung wildly between the stove's immediate radius and the outer walls. The simple fact of air that held at a livable temperature through the night, all of it was doing something to Eli's lungs that medicine and careful attention had not managed. The color in his face was different. He ate without being coaxed. He worked through the arithmetic problems Clara set him in the mornings, and twice she heard him laugh at something, with a real laugh, brief and unself-conscious. The laugh of a child whose body was not consuming every available resource just to maintain itself. She noted it as data, but she noted it. Roland Heck came on the 12th of December. She saw him through the south-facing window riding up the track at the unhurried pace of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it without rushing. He dismounted, tied the horse, and stood looking at the structure. He walked a slow circle around it, pressing his palm flat against the plastered exterior, at several points bending to examine where the base course met the packed earth foundation, looking at the roof and the chimney collar and the wood pile under the tarpaulin. Clara opened the door before he knocked. They stood in the doorway, she inside and he outside, the cold air moving between them. Heck looked past her at the low ceiling, the plastered walls, the small stove, Eli at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He took inventory with his eyes, the way he did everything methodically, storing what he saw for consideration. He asked how much wood she had burned. She told him 3/4 of a cord in 6 weeks. The change in his expression was small and would have been invisible to someone who did not know how to read him. It was the expression of a man whose arithmetic had just been revised in a direction he had not expected. 3/4 of a cord was what his family burned in 12 days. He was quiet for a moment. He said the inspector from the territorial office would come in spring when the pass cleared, weather permitting. Clara waited. Hecht said he had not withdrawn the letter. He said this without apology because he was not a man who apologized for deliberate decisions. But he had not pressed for an earlier visit. If she was still alive in spring, that would be answer enough. He had also recently learned about Helga Brandt's letter, which he had not known about when it was sent. He said this without emphasis, but Clara understood what it meant. A second letter sent without his knowledge was an irregularity that bothered a man who believed in controlling the processes within his domain. He looked at the structure one more time. Then he got on his horse and rode back toward the settlement, and Clara understood that she had been given something that was not approval and not forgiveness, but was the practical equivalent of both. She would not be interrupted before spring. Gareth Colton came 3 days later with a notebook and a measuring stick. He was not a man who announced changes to his position. He changed his mind the way he did everything, following evidence without ceremony. He had been watching the smoke from Clara's chimney since November, the thin, steady thread of it, and watching his own chimney, the thick rolling output of a stove, working hard against insufficient insulation. And he had been doing the arithmetic that any practical man does when two data points refuse to match his expectations. He asked the wall thickness, the staking intervals, the plaster mixture ratio, whether bales needed to cure before stacking. He wrote everything down carefully because information not written down had a way of becoming something slightly different from what it had been. He said his mother was old. The cold was harder on her every year, and the cabin she lived in at the north edge of his property was the worst built structure he owned. A small warming structure sized for one person would give her another decade if the mathematics held. Clara said she would help him build it. Colton said he would pay her. Clara said the hay was his anyway. They argued about this in the practical, slightly stubborn way of two people who both believed they were right about the same transaction. In the end, Colton left 3 laying hens tethered to the fence post and rode away before Clara could return them. She stood looking at the hens, which looked back at her with the frank incuriosity of poultry, and decided the matter was settled. Late December brought the warning signs, and the old-timers saw them and went quiet. The cattle on the open ranges had been bunching for weeks, refusing to scatter for grazing, pressing together, as though warmth was about to become a collective rather than an individual matter. The few elk still visible at lower elevations had pushed closer to the valley floor than anyone could remember seeing. The birds had gone silent, not quieter in the way of cold weather, but absent, as though every bird in the valley had received the same information on the same morning and acted on it together. The sunsets in late December were wrong in a way that was hard to name. Too red, too deep, the light filtering through something vast and invisible building in the upper atmosphere to the northwest. The old-timers who had survived 1881 looked at those sunsets and said nothing to each other, which communicated more than words would have, because silence among people who normally spoke freely about the weather meant that what they were seeing was outside the range of comfortable discussion. Clara watched all of it as information. She said nothing. She had tried saying things in September, and she knew what that cost and what it returned. What she did instead was check the wood pile every morning, check the stovepipe for creosote, check the plaster on the north wall for any new cracking. She kept the inside dry wood supply consistent. She kept the water buckets filled before each night. She kept Eli's medicine within reach of the bunk. She kept the barometer her father had brought from Hamburg on a nail beside the door, the one the mathematics teacher had pressed into Thomas's hands on the last morning before the family left for the port, and she checked it every morning and every evening and wrote the numbers in the same brown paper notebook she had used for the building calculations. In the first week of January, the barometer began to fall. Not in the measured decline of an ordinary incoming system. It fell with a purposefulness that made Clara's hand stop on the brass casing on the morning of the 7th. The needle was well below anything she had seen in the 7 months since Thomas had hung it on the nail. Outside the south window, the sky was a pale wash blue that looked normal and was not. The air had the quality of a held breath. She added 2 extra loads of wood to the inside supply, refilled both water buckets, checked the door hardware and the shutter latches in the chimney collar. She told Eli to stay inside. The morning of January the 8th broke at 32 degrees. After weeks of temperatures well below zero, 32 degrees felt to an acclimatized body like something close to warmth. The human nervous system, optimized for the present moment, interpreted the number as good news, and the settlement responded accordingly. The Colton children were outside before breakfast, in coats too light for January. Men rode toward the settlement without full cold weather gear. Someone opened the boarding house windows to air the rooms. The valley had the tentative quality of a place that had been expecting punishment and believed it had received a reprieve. Clara stepped outside and stood for a moment in the still air. 32 degrees in January, arriving after sustained deep cold, carried a different quality than 32 degrees in September. The stillness was absolute in a way that ordinary cold mornings were not. No wind, no bird sound, no creak of frozen trees, no distant cattle noise. Nothing. The sky to the northwest was the same pale wash blue as yesterday, but there was something at the horizon, a density, a suggestion of pressure gathering. Not yet visible as weather, but present as something that preceded weather and was larger than it. The barometer that morning had fallen further than it had ever fallen. Clara went back inside. She told Eli to move his things to the upper bunk. She fed the stove until it was running hot and loaded it again and adjusted the damper to a long, slow burn. She moved the inside wood supply away from the exterior wall and closer to the stove. She drove additional nails through the leather door hinges. She wedged the shutter from the inside with a cutboard. Eli watched all of this from the table. He asked what was happening. Clara said she thought the weather was going to change. He asked how much. She looked at the barometer. She looked at the north wall, the thick plastered surface holding 54 degrees of differential between inside and outside without visible effort. She thought about the elk in September, the river of them flowing down from the high country with the purposeful steadiness of things that possessed knowledge, the instruments and the old-timers, and the accumulated experience of 11 Montana winters had not yet accessed. She said she thought it was going to change a great deal. January the 9th arrived quietly at first light, 30 degrees and still. The morning passed without drama. Clara fed the stove on schedule and did not open the door except briefly to bring in 2 additional armloads of outside wood. Eli worked through his arithmetic and read from the Bible their mother had carried from their previous life, the pages worn at the corners from Margaret's hands and then from Clara's. At 2 in the afternoon, Clara looked through the south window and saw the horizon change. It did not look like weather arriving. Weather arrived gradually at the edges of perception building over hours. What came from the northwest on the afternoon of January 9th was a wall, gray-black and absolute, stretching from one edge of the visible world to the other, without gap or variation, moving across the valley at the speed of a running horse, consuming the pale winter sky ahead of it, the way a wave consumed the shore it reached without hurry, without the possibility of anything stopping it. Claire had the door barred and the last armload of outside wood inside before the leading edge of the storm reached the homestead. She fed the stove 3 medium pieces of dry pine, the size that burned long and hot without requiring attention, for 40 minutes. She sat on the floor near the stove with her back against the south wall. The storm hit the structure at 3:15. The sound was not the howling of the blizzard stories. It was lower than that. A sustained all-directional pressure of sound, a roar rather than a howl, as though the atmosphere had decided to press down on everything simultaneously. The hay walls absorbed it. The 3 feet of compressed grass between the interior air and the outside world took the acoustic energy of the storm and converted it into something muffled and distant. A sound that was happening to other people rather than to 2 children near a small stove in an 8 by 10-foot room. By 4 o'clock, the outside thermometer read 10 below zero. Inside, 48 degrees. A differential of 58 degrees maintained by grass and mud. By 6:20 below outside, 46 inside. The stove running steady, the wood supply measured and rationed with the precision Claire had been practicing for 5 months. By midnight, the outside thermometer showed 35 below zero. The wind was running at a velocity she could estimate by the pitch of the sound and the behavior of the chimney smoke, which she could see in the dim light being torn horizontally the instant it cleared the cap. 60 miles per hour, possibly more. The combination of temperature and wind produced conditions that, from her father's winter mathematics, killed exposed flesh in under 3 minutes. The open-range cattle that had not found windbreak shelter were dying in the fields. The elk that had come down from the mountains in September and pressed to the valley floor in December were pressed even lower now, their bodies turned from the wind, their thick winter coats doing what they had grown all fall to do. Inside the hay shelter, the temperature stabilized at 46 degrees. Clara fed the stove at measured intervals. She slept in 2-hour stretches with Eli's blanket across her shoulders and the stove's heat against the left side of her face. She woke when the room temperature dropped a degree from the fire burning low. Fed it again, calculated the wood consumption, recalculated the remaining supply, slept again. This was not heroism, it was management. It was the continuous series of small, correct decisions made with accurate information that her father had tried to teach her. Survival actually was not drama and not courage, but arithmetic applied patiently over time. On the morning of January the 11th, someone knocked on the door. Clara's first thought was that the sound was structural, the wind finding a resonance with the door's frame. Her second thought was that it was a person, and that a person outside in these conditions had been outside too long already. She was at the door before she had fully formed the second thought. Ruth Hex stood in the snow. Behind her, pressed against her skirts with their arms wrapped around her waist, were two small children. Oscar was 6 years old and Lena was 4, and they were shivering with the full-body violence of children who had been cold long enough that the shivering was no longer generating warmth, but was simply the body's last unresigned argument against a process that was winning. Ruth Heck's face carried the particular quality of someone who has spent an hour deciding whether to do something they would never have imagined doing, who has arrived with the decision made, but the cost of it still visible. She said the roof. She said the snow weight. She said it had come down on the north side in the night, the ceiling of their main room open to the sky and filling with snow. Roland working to repair it in the cold and the dark. The temperature inside their cabin dropping toward freezing the children. She stopped. She looked at Clara, the woman whose husband had told a 14-year-old girl that there was no other way. The woman whose family had written to the territorial authority about 2 orphan children in dangerous conditions. She stood on the threshold of a house made from damaged hay and creek mud, asking to come in. Clara stepped back from the door. 5 people in 80 square feet was not a design specification. The wood consumption mathematics changed immediately and required rapid recalculation. 2 adult bodies and 2 additional child bodies added heat to the interior, partially offsetting the losses from the door having been opened. The net effect was approximately neutral on temperature, which meant the rationing that had worked for 2 would continue working for 5 with adjustment. Clara made the adjustment. She put the children on the lower bunk with Eli's blankets. Eli moved to the floor near the stove without complaint, with the stoicism of a child who has learned that conditions change and adaptation is the appropriate response. Ruth Hecht stood against the south wall, her coat still on, apologizing in a low, steady voice, saying they would leave as soon as Roland made the roof safe enough, saying she understood this was an imposition. Clara told her to stop apologizing. She said it without sharpness as a practical observation. Apologizing used energy the situation did not require. Ruth Hecht stopped apologizing. She looked at the children on the bunk, at the thermometer, reading 47 degrees at the small stove burning with its measured efficiency. She looked at the walls, the interior plaster surface, the bales visible at the top of the north wall. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone seeing something they had heard described and not quite believed, until the moment of direct experience changed the nature of the evidence. She said nothing for a long time. On the third day, she said it quietly to no one in particular, the way you say a thing that has needed saying long enough that it must finally be said, it is warm. Your walls hold warm, she said. In the Hecht cabin with the stove running at full capacity, they had not been able to maintain 30 degrees. 3 times the wood and cold every night for a month. She looked at Clara. She asked, "How did you know?" Clara thought about the elk in September, the river of animals moving down from the high country with the knowledge that the instruments and the old-timers and the accumulated wisdom of 11 Montana winters had not yet reached. She thought about her father at the kitchen table in Hamburg, talking about the old mountain people who paid attention to things other people had long ago stopped noticing. She thought about standing at the Colton fence line in the September dusk, looking at hay bales the way Thomas Voss had taught her to look at everything as a problem in mathematics, as a question of what a thing was and what it could do. She said, "I guessed." Ruth Heck looked at her for a moment. Then she looked away at the children at the stove at the walls. She understood Clara thought that the answer was not incomplete, so much as it was untranslatable into the vocabulary available to the two of them in this room at this time. Some answers were true and insufficient simultaneously, and the only thing to do with them was leave them where they were. The roof repairs took 6 days. 6 days because the temperature outside never climbed above -20. 6 days because the wind did not stop below a sustained velocity that made outdoor work a continuous negotiation with the possibility of frostbite. 6 days because what had hit the valley on January 9th was not a blizzard in the ordinary sense, but something larger, something that had been building in the atmosphere to the northwest for weeks and had arrived with the patience and thoroughness of a thing that had been preparing for a long time. The Great Die-Up, they would call it afterward. The winter that ended the open range era, the season that broke a generation of ranchers and drove thousands of settlers from the territory. In January of 1887, no one had a name for it yet. It was simply the new standard of terrible, against which all future winters would be measured. Inside the hay shelter, the temperature held between 46 and 50 degrees through all 6 days. On the afternoon of January 17, during a 3-hour pause in the wind that was not a break in the storm, but a reorganization of it, 3 men from the settlement found Orrin Seeger in the snow. He was 200 yards from his cabin. He was lying face down, arms slightly out from his sides, the posture of someone who had fallen and had not gotten up. He was facing southeast, which was the wrong direction. His cabin was to the northwest. He had gone out into the whiteout to find deadfall timber and had gotten turned around in visibility of 0 when the landmarks he depended on had been erased by the same weather that made the wood necessary. His woodpile had been short. Short in the particular way it had been short for 5 years. Short by the margin a man accumulates when he has stopped investing fully in his own continuation. He had helped build the east wall with his own hands. He had asked the right questions about staking intervals and plaster thickness and the thermal properties of compressed hay. He had felt the warmth radiating from the plastered surface in October and understood what the mathematics meant. He had gone home and not built anything for himself. Martha had been right. He had known it in October when the structure held warmth against his hands. He had gone home with the answer he had come to find. It had been enough for him. The question he had been carrying for 5 years had been answered, and the answer belonged to Martha, and that was what he had needed. He was buried beside her in late March when the ground softened enough to receive him. Clara came to the burial. She stood at the edge of the gathered people and did not speak. There were not words adequate to what Orrin Seeger had been in this story. The man who had come too late and helped anyway, who had answered a debt of 20 years by building someone else's wall, and then gone home to his insufficient woodpile with his answer and his peace, and made the choice that he made. She stood at his grave until the others had gone, and then she stood a little longer, and then she walked home. February came in waves. Not a continuous assault, but a sequence of storms separated by days of brutal cold that felt like reprieves and were not the temperature, never rising above 0. Between the major events, the snow on the valley floor accumulating to depths that made travel between homesteads an undertaking requiring planning and provisions. The man who ran the general store had opened his doors as an emergency shelter and kept 3 families alive through the worst of it, burning through his own fuel supply to do so, surviving only because one of those families hauled wood from a collapsed barn 3 miles away during a brief window when travel was possible. He emerged from the winter looking 20 years older than when it had started and did not speak of those weeks for the rest of that year. Ruth Hecht and the children returned to the rebuilt cabin on the 22nd of January during a brief interval between storms. Roland had patched the roof, added extra bracing, gathered additional wood, with help from neighbors during the 3-hour pause on the 17th. They would survive. Clara could see it in the efficiency of Ruth's movements as she gathered the children's things from the bunk. At the door, Ruth stopped. She set down the bag as she was carrying and turned and took 3 steps back toward Clara and embraced her. Not the brief social embrace of polite acknowledgement, but something that required more from both of them, the kind of contact between people who have been through a thing together and are acknowledging it without the words that adequate acknowledgement would require, because the adequate words did not exist. Clara stood with her arms at her sides for a moment and then put them around Ruth Heck's back, and they stood like that for several seconds in the doorway while the Montana wind pressed against the exterior plaster and found nothing to grip. Ruth picked up the bag and took the children and walked toward the settlement road without looking back. Clara watched her until the white of the snow and the white of the sky absorbed them into the distance, and then she went inside and put a piece of wood on the fire. March. The first morning of March, Clara woke to silence. Not the silence between storm waves. A different silence, absolute and soft, of a quality she identified before she was fully awake, somewhere in the part of consciousness that had been monitoring conditions for 6 weeks without full rest. She lay still and listened and understood what it meant. She opened the door. The world outside was white and immense and motionless. The sky was a pale blue, the ordinary blue of a winter morning, tipping towards something else. Not the wrong blue of January's false warmth, but the transparent, thinning blue of a sky beginning to let the sun reassert itself. The temperature stood at 12 above zero, genuinely cold, but cold in the ordinary direction, cold that would climb 10 degrees by afternoon and 10 more the following week. It was over. Eli came to stand beside her in the doorway. He was taller than he had been in August, or seemed so because he was standing fully upright without the slight protective hunching that cold and coughing had imposed on him for months. His coat was too short at the wrists. His face had color that had nothing to do with fever. He looked at the valley, at the deep snow covering everything, at the smoke rising in thin lines from the cabins that had made it at the terrible white silence of the cabins from which no smoke rose. He asked if it was over. Clara looked at the sky. She looked at the barometer through the open door, the needle moving for the first time in weeks upward. She said yes, it was over. The reports came in through March and April as the passes cleared and the territory took stock. Cattle losses across the open ranges ran between 50 and 90%. The era of the open range, the free grazing system that had defined Montana ranching for 2 decades, was finished. The ranchers who had counted on unmanaged grazing across unfenced land would not recover. The economics of cattle raising in the territory would have to be rebuilt from different assumptions, with hay and shelter and winter planning replacing the illusion that the land itself would provide indefinitely. Human deaths were harder to count. Dozens confirmed, more who would not be found until the snow retreated fully. People who had stepped outside for firewood and gotten turned around in the white void. People whose cabins had failed before their wood supply ran out. People whose wood supply had run out before their cabins failed. Roland Hecht came in April. The snow was still deep in the shadows along the north fence line, but the south-facing slopes showed brown grass, and the creek had broken its ice and was running loud and high with snowmelt. He rode up the track and dismounted, and stood looking at the hay shelter for a long time. He walked around it the way he had walked around it in December, but with different attention, the attention of someone who was no longer auditing a claim, but reading a completed result. He came to stand at the door where Claire was waiting. He said, "You burn less than 3 cords." She said, "Yes." He said, "I burn nearly 12." He said it without drama, as a fact stated plainly between 2 people who understood its full weight. 12 cords against 3 cords. The 400% difference between those numbers represented the entirety of what the hay walls had done and what they would do for anyone who built them with adequate thickness and adequate plaster and the understanding of what they were actually trying to accomplish. He looked at the old log cabin 50 feet away, empty all winter. The chinking mud cracked further by the cold frost damage visible on the north-facing logs. He said the elk, back in September. She said, "I saw them." He was quiet for a while. A chickadee landed on the top of the north wall, tilted its head at them with frank curiosity, and flew away. The creek ran in the distance. The mountains above the valley were still white to their shoulders, the snowpack that would feed the summer grasses and the summer water and the summer existence of everyone in the valley. Hext reached into his coat and brought out an envelope. He held it out. She took it. Inside was the homestead claim that Thomas Voss had filed on the land he had staked in the spring of 1886. The name at the top of the document was Thomas Voss in the clerk's careful handwriting. Below it in handwriting, slightly different, slightly less practiced, with the particular pen the territorial office kept, was another name, Clara Voss. Hext said I had the clerk amend the registration. You will need to file papers when you come of age, but the claim is yours. Your father's land. Your land now. Clara held the document and looked at the names her father's crossed out with a single precise line, hers written beneath, in the hand of someone who had taken the task seriously. Her hands were not steady. She did not attempt to make them steady because that would have required energy she was willing to spend on other things. She said, "Thank you." Hecht said, "I will not say I was wrong in front of the settlement. That is not how things are done." He paused. He looked at the hay shelter one more time, at the walls that had held 48 degrees, while his cabin struggled to hold 30, at the woodpile that still had a cord remaining when the worst winter in living memory finally broke. He said, "But I am saying it now. To you." He got on his horse. He had gone about 20 feet when he stopped and looked back. He said, "My barn, the one that has been standing since '78, the coldest building on my property, worse than useless for livestock in a hard winter." He said that if someone were to show him how this worked, the stacking and the plaster and all of it, he might be persuaded to build an addition. A warm addition. Clara looked at the man who had told her there was no other way. The survivor of 11 Montana winters who had burned 12 cords while she burned 3. The man who would not say he was wrong in front of the settlement, but had said it to her, which was the only version of the sentence he had available, and which was she understood, not a small thing for a man like Roland Hecht. She said, "I will show you." Gareth Colton came the following week with his notebook and his measuring stick and 3 more pages of questions. He had already broken ground on the small structure for his mother working from the notes he had taken in December, and he needed clarification on corner bracing and optimal plaster moisture content. He stayed 2 hours and left with the pages full. He paid Clara in eggs a dozen twice a week, which she accepted because eggs were practical and argument over practical matters was a waste of time her father had never indulged. Helga Brandt did not come in April, not in the first weeks of May. Clara had not expected her to because Helga Brandt was not a woman whose internal landscape included an easy path from having been wrong to acknowledging it. She had written a letter in genuine fear for a child's life, fear shaped by the specific form of her own loss. And the letter had been wrong in its conclusions, but had not been wrong in its fear. And the distance between those two things was too complicated for a simple apology to span. On a Tuesday in late April, Clara came back from the creek to find a flour sack and a small cotton bag on the flat stone beside the door. The flour sack was full. The cotton bag held sugar, perhaps 3 pounds of it, a luxury in the spring of 1887, when the supply trains were only beginning to move again after months of closure. No note, no footprint still legible in the mud, because the morning warmth had softened the ground, and whatever impressions had been left had blurred into indistinction. Clara stood looking at the flour and the sugar. She picked them up and took them inside and set them on the table and looked at them again. They were a flour sack and a bag of sugar left on a stone by a woman who had done something she could not undo and could not speak about and could not do nothing about either, and had found the only form her acknowledgement could take. It was enough. It was exactly enough. The method spread the way useful things spread in places where people are paying close attention to survival, not through formal demonstrations, but through the communication that happens when people have seen something work and understand what it means. Through the smoke from Clara's chimney that everyone in the valley had watched all winter and done the arithmetic on. Through the people who had heard what Hecht's barn addition looked like and ridden over to see it for themselves. Through the freighter from Bozeman who spent a night in Mercer Creek in May, heard the story from 3 different people in the course of one evening, and carried it north to a man who needed to rebuild after losing his cabin to fire and had nothing left but hay and the willingness to try something he had never heard of trying. Clara taught anyone who asked. She walked settlers through the process with a patience she had not known she possessed until the winter had required it, and she had found out she had it. She answered questions about staking intervals and plaster mixture and roof loading and the minimum wall thickness for adequate thermal performance in temperatures below -30. She refused payment every time. When people insisted, she said the hay was free and the knowing should be too, and she pressed the money or the goods back until people stopped insisting, which they generally did after the third time. By the fall of 1887, 4 hay bale structures stood within 10 miles of Mercer Creek. A fifth went up near Bozeman, built by a family that had heard the story from the freighter who had heard it in May. Others appeared across the territory as the story traveled the way stories traveled in that country person to person, across distances that seemed to shrink the more important the information was. They were called grass houses for a time, and then the name faded because names that describe what something is made of tend to dissolve when the thing becomes common enough that its material is simply understood. They were what you built when you understood the mathematics. The warmest structures on the frontier assembled from materials that everyone had and no one had thought to use differently than they always had been used. Eli's lungs never fully healed. The damage was too old and too deep for any amount of consistent warmth to fully reverse. But consistent warmth had kept the damage from progressing, and not progressing was in the arithmetic of Eli Voss's health, the difference between a life that ended early and a life that went on. He was thin, and he coughed sometimes in cold weather, and he grew up in warm homes. Every one of them built to a standard that a 14-year-old girl had established in the fall of 1886 from materials no one had wanted. Clara proved up the Voss homestead claim at 19, one of the youngest women in Montana Territory, to complete the 5-year residency requirement. The land her father had staked in the spring of 1886 and died preparing for in the summer of the same year was hers in the eyes of the territorial law, which had finally caught up to what she had decided for herself back in August of 1886, when she set down her father's axe on the chopping block and chose to think about mathematics instead of fear. The night of January the 9th, 1888, exactly 1 year after the wall of gray-black cloud had moved across the valley at the speed of a galloping horse and changed what the territory understood about cold. Clara sat in the hay shelter near the stove with her father's coat across her shoulders. Outside, the temperature was 20 below zero. The wind moved across the valley with the ordinary purposefulness of winter wind in Montana, finding the gaps in structures that had gaps and working on them with patient persistence. The barometer on the nail beside the door was stable. Eli was asleep on the bunk, breathing slow and even, the sound of a person whose lungs were managing their work without extraordinary effort. The stove ticked its small metallic rhythm, the sound of iron doing what iron did when heat moved through it. The walls held the warmth the way they had held it all winter and the winter before, the way they would hold it for as many winters as the plaster stayed. Sound and the bales stayed dry, and the mathematics continued to work, which Clara expected would be a very long time. Thomas Voss had taught his daughter to count. He had taught her with brown paper and a stub of pencil with measurements taken in the early morning before the day's work began, with a plumb line carried from Hamburg in a cloth bag, and a thermometer given by a teacher who had understood that a boy who could measure things precisely was a boy who could survive things that less precise boys could not. He had taught her that numbers were not cold things but living things, that they told you the truth when everything else was trying to tell you something easier and less useful, that the gap between what you had and what you needed was not a reason to despair, but a problem to be solved if you were willing to follow the calculation wherever it led, regardless of whether anyone had followed it there before. She had counted everything: the wood, the money, the days between her father's death and the first frost, the weight of each bale and the number of bales required, and the time remaining to move and stack and plaster them before the ground froze. She had counted the elk moving through the valley in September, when everyone with more experience than she had told her that elk moving in September meant nothing. She had counted the cords of wood her structure required against the cords of wood her structure consumed, and she had counted the degrees of differential between inside and outside. and watched the number hold steady through the worst winter in living memory. She had counted right. Outside, the wind moved across the valley. Inside, the walls held. Eli breathed. The stove ticked. The barometer on the nail beside the door did not move. That was all. That had been enough.